Trees. Beautiful. Protective. Necessary. Imagine the Canadian prairies with no trees. There would be no shade when it's hot, no accessible firewood when it's cold, and no homes for our wild animals. There would be nothing but bare, flat grasslands. Back in the late 1800s, this was the case. This is the story of how one family's love for trees transformed the Canadian prairies. And it all started in Brandon, Manitoba. Brandon has changed a lot since the late 1800s, when Henry Louis Patmore first arrived from Essex, England. There were no trees to protect those settlers from the wind. In fact, there were no trees anywhere. Patmore was the one who started the movement. It would be the first time trees would be planted on the bald prairies.
Henry Louis Patmore was born in 1861 from the beautiful Garden County of Essex in England.
In 1879, at the age of 18, Henry Patmore's health began to fail. He heard about the great Canadian West and how its drier climate would be beneficial to his health. Shortly, Patmore set sail for Canada. On his way west, he stopped in Brandon, Manitoba. It was here that he learned about the propagation and the growing of trees in the Canadian climate.
His first impression on arriving in Brandon was a vast city of tents. He walked out on 9th Street to the corner of 9th and Queen's Avenue. He came to a small nursery. This was a good sign of the further possibilities of this country.
H.L. Patmore came to Manitoba, tried to homestead initially out by Reston, but threw in the towel on that and went to British Columbia.
Although Patmore headed west to Agassiz, British Columbia, a town surrounded by mountains, he preferred the wide open spaces of the prairies. He returned to Brandon in the late 1880s, arriving by train shortly after the CPR tracks had been laid.
He arrived in Brandon with very little money in his pocket, as did many immigrants in those days, but this was the land of opportunity, and hopes were high. There were no native trees in Brandon when my father first came here, only a few native shrubs growing along the river banks.
Patmore worked at the experimental farm, where he tested different trees and shrubs' abilities to survive the Manitoba winter. It was here he learned how important these shrubs were to the farmers settling on the land.
H.L. Patmore, of course, had first-hand experience in horticulture from his family. He knew that business. And so he took employment at the experimental farm, and that farm was preoccupied with developing dry land farming techniques. How do you farm in the prairies? New species of grain, new species of trees that were suitable to the region.
The Brandon Research Station at that time propagated all the trees and shrubs for the prairie farms that were being developed, and they needed somebody to propagate the trees.
To meet this demand, Henry Patmore bought the nursery at 9th and Queen's Avenue, which he had visited when he first came to Brandon.
It was during this period in the 1890s that Mr. Patmore planted trees on the boulevards of the residential streets of Brandon. My brother, R.H. Patmore, grew up in the nursery business and became very familiar with all aspects of the trade. During the winter season, soft coal from Estevan was used to heat the greenhouses in the extreme cold of winter. This had to be drawn and unloaded from the CPR station, which was close by. This work was all done under the supervision of H.L. Patmore and his son, R.H. Patmore.
In 1914, all able men on the nursery staff had to go to war. The horses were sold and mechanization took over. Digging and cultivation were now done by tractors. The 40-acre plot of nursery land was sold for real estate. Patmore's entire crop was shipped by train to the Dust Bowls of the West to help stop the soil erosion problem.
In 1934, as the Depression started, Mr. Patmore's health was beginning to fail. After a long life in the nursery business, he passed away in 1946. He had a long and fruitful life. He died at the age of 86 years. To him, this life was in itself richly rewarding. He would not have asked for anything different.
After his death, for his tremendous contribution to agriculture and horticulture, H.L. Patmore's name was placed in the Agricultural Hall of Fame in Austin, Manitoba.
The beauty of the trees and shrubs on the streets of the cities in the Western Canada were the fulfillment of the dream of H.L. Patmore.
It was then necessary to reorganize the business. Patmore's son Richard became head of the nursery. Like his father, Richard was very interested in introducing as many varieties as possible that were hardy enough to withstand the harsh western climate.
He specialized in evergreens. They required very special treatment in grafting and budding, and he was able to develop this right on the nursery.
Those were the only evergreens that were grafted and budded in Western Canada at that time. The Patmore green ash was yet another important contribution the family made to the prairie landscape.
It was identified to be very hardy, to have a very beautiful form, to be a suitable boulevard tree, shelter belt tree, and obviously people like it because it's been planted all throughout North America.
With many horticultural accomplishments to his credit, Richard Patmore retired in 1970. He too was recognized for his role in bringing trees to the Canadian prairie. Richard Patmore died in 1979.
The beautifying the city of Brandon made this city very well known from coast to coast for the beauty of her streets, as well as making Brandon a very pleasant place to live.
While going green has been the byword of the last couple of decades, perhaps the real green movement began more than a century and a half ago on what was then the barren Canadian prairie. And the fathers of that movement, the men who started it all, seedling by seedling, leaf by leaf, were Richard and his father, Henry Patmore.